The seatbelt sign blinked to life with a soft chime, and a voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're expecting a bit of turbulence as we cross into the Atlantic, so please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. Daniel Carter exhaled slowly, tightening his grip on the armrests. He hated flying. The enclosed space, the unnatural sensation of being thousands of feet above the ground, the helplessness of surrendering control to an unseen pilot, it all set his nerves on edge. His fingers tapped anxiously against the plastic armrest, a habit he developed over years of business trips that required air travel. It never got easier. The plane hummed steadily, a mechanical beast slicing through the night sky. Soft cabin lights cast a warm glow over the rows of passengers, some reading, others dozing, a few murmuring in low voices. A baby fussed somewhere in the back. A flight attendant strolled down the aisle with practiced grace, checking seatbelts and offering reassuring smiles. Daniel glanced at the screen in front of him. The animated map displayed their flight path, a white arc stretching across the dark blue expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. 4 hours until London. Just 4 more hours, he told himself. He adjusted the air vent above his head, letting the cool breeze wash over his face. Then it happened. A jolt, sharp and sudden, rattled the plane. Gasps filled the cabin as overhead bins creaked and a few loose items slid from tray tables. The lights flickered. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. He turned to the window. Nothing but darkness and distant flashes of lightning. The pilot's voice returned, but this time there was an edge to it. Ladies and gentlemen, we seem to have encountered an unexpected storm system. Please remain calm and seated. Flight attendants, prepare for turbulence. The hum of conversation rose as nervous passengers exchanged glances. The attendants moved swiftly, securing carts and fastening their own seatbelts. Another jolt. Harder this time. The plane dipped, then steadied, only to lurch sideways. A woman let out a short scream. The baby wailed. Daniel's hands gripped the seat in front of him, knuckles white. A deafening crack tore through the air. The cabin lights cut out entirely, plunging them into near darkness, save for the eerie glow of emergency strips along the aisle. The aircraft shuddered violently, as if gripped by an invisible force. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling like lifeless marionettes. Panic erupted. A man in first class cursed, struggling to pull his mask down. A flight attendant shouted instructions, but her voice was lost in the chaos. Daniel fumbled with his own mask, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The plane was in free fall now, a gut-wrenching sensation that made his stomach lurch into his throat. Outside, lightning slashed through the sky, illuminating the turbulent clouds that swallowed them whole. The engines roared, sputtered, then roared again. Daniel felt his seatbelt digging into his waist as the force of gravity pinned him down. A voice, barely audible over the screaming wind, echoed through the cockpit speakers. Mayday, Mayday. This is Flight 327. The transmission cut to static. The descent was relentless. The plane tilted violently, sending loose objects flying through the cabin. A suitcase struck an overhead panel, bursting open and scattering clothes midair. Someone was praying, their voice rising in desperation. Another passenger sobbed uncontrollably. Through the chaos, Daniel turned his gaze to the window. For a split second, he saw the ground rushing up to meet them, a dense forest, dark and unyielding, stretching endlessly beneath the storm-ridden sky. Then impact. The world shattered around him. The first jolt was sudden but not alarming. A ripple of unease passed through the cabin as the plane trembled, and then, just as quickly, steadied. Daniel Carter exhaled, gripping the armrests of his seat. He hated turbulence, but he had been through it before. The seatbelt sign dinged overhead, and a polite but firm voice crackled through the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are encountering some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Daniel tried to focus on his breathing, ignoring the beads of sweat forming at his temples. Outside the window, the sky was ink black, clouds thick and endless. A flash of lightning illuminated the horizon, followed almost instantly by a deep, rolling boom of thunder. Another jolt, this time stronger. The plane dipped sharply, and a few gasps echoed through the cabin. Daniel's stomach lurched. A cart from the galley rattled down the aisle, its contents clattering violently. The pilot's voice returned, noticeably strained. "Flight attendants, please take your seats immediately." The words sent a chill through Daniel. He turned to glance at the other passengers. Some were whispering nervously, others gripping their armrests as he was. Across the aisle, a young woman clutched her partner's hand so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Then the plane dropped. Not a dip, not a tremble, a full, gut-wrenching plunge. A woman screamed. Overhead compartments burst open, luggage spilling into the aisles. Someone's drink flew across the cabin, splattering against a seatback. The baby in the back wailed, shrill and piercing. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. His fingers dug into the fabric of his seat. The aircraft shuddered violently, as if gripped by an invisible hand. Another bolt of lightning illuminated the sky outside. Daniel caught a glimpse of something unnatural in the storm clouds, a shape, dark and looming, just for a fraction of a second. His breath caught, but before he could process it, the plane lurched sideways. People screamed. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, swaying like ghostly marionettes. The overhead lights flickered, casting the cabin in eerie, sporadic flashes. A man in the row ahead fumbled to secure his mask, his hands trembling so violently he could barely grasp it. Daniel forced himself to move. His own mask dangled before him, swaying wildly with the plane's violent jerks. He yanked it over his nose and mouth, inhaling deeply. The oxygen was cold, sterile, and sharp in his lungs. The plane was still falling. The sheer force pressed him into his seat, making movement almost impossible. His ears popped painfully. A loud bang. Metal groaned somewhere near the wing. A sickening jolt shuddered through the aircraft, and suddenly, Daniel felt the undeniable sensation of tilting, not turbulence, but a full, uncontrolled descent. "Mayday! Mayday!" The pilot's voice cut through the chaos, barely audible over the roaring wind and shrieking alarms. "This is Flight 327. We are..." Static. The nose of the plane tipped downward. The world outside the window became a blur of rain and darkness. The screaming grew louder, raw panic seeping into every breath. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. He thought of his family, of the life he had built, of the things he had taken for granted. The people he loved. The things he never said. Another explosion rocked the plane, and suddenly, everything inside tilted violently to one side. Daniel's head slammed against the window. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he saw that shape again in the storm, closer this time, more defined. Watching. The plane continued its deadly descent, spiraling toward the unseen ground below. Darkness. A thick, suffocating void wrapped around Daniel Carter as his consciousness teetered between reality and oblivion. A distant ringing filled his ears, a dull, pulsing ache that refused to fade. Then, a new sound emerged, a soft crackling, like the remnants of a dying fire. He forced his eyes open. Blurred shadows danced before him, shifting between the orange glow of embers and the deep, engulfing black of the forest. Smoke coiled through the air, carrying the acrid scent of burning metal and charred earth. The wreckage was scattered across the ground, twisted metal glistening under the faint moonlight. Pain shot through his body as he tried to move. His ribs protested, his limbs heavy as if weighed down by an unseen force. With gritted teeth, he pushed himself up, his fingers sinking into the damp soil. The sharp sting of a gash on his forehead sent a wave of dizziness through him, but he steadied himself against a broken seat wedged into the ground. The silence was eerie. No cries, no voices, no signs of life beyond the distant crackling of flames. His breath came in shallow gasps as his mind struggled to process the devastation around him. He turned his gaze to the fuselage, or what remained of it. The once pristine cabin was now a broken skeleton of jagged metal and shattered glass. A part of him refused to believe he was the only one left. He took a shaky step forward, his body protesting with every movement. "Hellos." His voice was hoarse, barely louder than a whisper. He swallowed, tried again. "Is anyone there?" Silence. He staggered through the wreckage, scanning for any sign of movement. Bodies lay motionless amidst the debris, faces unrecognizable beneath streaks of blood and soot. His stomach lurched, but he forced himself to keep moving. Then something shifted. A whisper of sound, barely perceptible over the crackling fire. He turned sharply, his pulse hammering in his throat. Nothing. Daniel clenched his fists, his breath ragged. He wasn't alone. The sensation crawled up his spine, an unshakable certainty that something or someone was watching. He stepped forward, his feet crunching over broken glass and torn metal. A flicker of movement in the periphery of his vision sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He turned swiftly, heart pounding. Shadows. Just shadows. Or so he told himself. The wreckage loomed around him, a graveyard of twisted steel and broken lives. And yet, something about the silence felt wrong. It wasn't just emptiness, it was waiting. A rustling sound echoed from beyond the wreckage. He wasn't alone. Swallowing hard, Daniel forced himself to move toward the noise. Every step was careful, deliberate. The remains of a plane cast eerie silhouettes against the moonlit sky, their jagged edges like the bones of a long-dead creature. Then he saw it. A set of footprints in the mud, fresh and leading away from the crash site. His heart stuttered. If there were footprints, there had to be survivors. But something about them unsettled him. They were uneven, dragging in places, as if whoever left them had been struggling. Or running. He hesitated, glancing back at the wreckage. The silence pressed against him, heavy and oppressive. Whatever had survived this crash, whoever had survived, was out there.
And he needed to find them.
Bracing himself, Daniel followed the footprints into the trees, leaving the smoldering wreckage behind.